Our next speaker is a former gubernatorial candidate, Dan Proft, who is he's a champion for the special needs in the state of Illinois. I have so much respect for him for doing that, and I appreciate it. And he's also WLS morning talk show host. So please welcome Dan Proft.
Thank you. So you got to hear from two kind of clean-cut together military guys, and you get to hear from a radio guy who can barely dress himself, as you can see. I do have to say something about Paul Schimpf, because elections are about contrast, you know. And think about the choice that we have for Attorney General. On the one hand, you've got a guy who was part of an organization that found a dictator in a spider hole in the middle of a desert and prosecuted him under international law, ultimately leading to his execution, appropriately so. And on the other hand, you have somebody who hasn't been able to find a corrupt public official in this state in 12 years. So you are not going to find a more distinct, a sharper contrast in this country for the state's chief law enforcement officer than that contrast. So it's very exciting to see some new leadership coming to the fore on the statewide ticket, as well as with congressional races and down in state legislative races, including state legislative races. It's about time we turn the page and usher in a new generation of leadership. And by that, I don't necessarily mean by age, but I mean by kind of mentality, disposition, what's going on between your ears, policy agenda. And that's happening in the Republican Party and the conservative grassroots movement in this state. And it's happening because the Tea Party has been an accountability mechanism not for kind of the political ruling class of both parties. And we need you to continue to do that in order to affect the change that swings the pendulum back towards big citizen and small government, like Jack Roser said. The good news is there's a lot of help out there on the hustings. I have the opportunity to travel around the state a bit and talk to a lot of folks, and it's a lot of fun. And I was recently heading down to Southern Illinois to speak at the Macoupin County Lincoln Day dinner. Macoupin County is down there by St. Louis. And so, there you go, one Cardinals fan in the audience. And so I was running a little bit late. It's a bit of a hike to get down there, and as we're making the final turn to the location where the dinner was, we get teed up by a state trooper. We're going a little bit beyond the speed limit. I appreciate that Jim Oberweis has raised the speed limit by 5 miles an hour, but I need about 25 miles an hour more of margin for error. So I'm going to have to talk to him about that. And so the state trooper pulls us over, obviously speeding, and he says, what's the rush? I said, well, we're going to a dinner. We're late. So, well, you guys are from Chicago. It must be an important dinner. What do you do? And I said, well, I work for WLS Radio. I'm speaking at this dinner. So, well, what's this dinner all about that you came all the way from Chicago? I said, well, it's a group of people that are trying to retire Pat Quinn as governor. And he came back and gave us a warning and wished us a good night, told us to slow down. So, just kind of highlighting the appetite that exists out there for qualitatively different leadership, to retire the people that have been in office for a long time and have destroyed this state's economy, because that's what they've done. And I think one of the things that we need to understand, though, is that in Illinois, the conventional wisdom about politics is conventionally and consistently wrong. And so let me just say something about Pat Quinn, because I think it's important to convey who Pat Quinn is with some specific focus on the governor's race and how that impacts races down ballot, particularly state legislative races. The conventional wisdom on Pat Quinn is he's kind of this avuncular, hapless guy who's maybe a bit out over his skis, kind of a Chauncey Gardner character, but he's generally honest, and he's kind-hearted, and he's well-intended. He's just not very good at what he does. Well, that turns out to be not true across the board. It turns out that Pat Quinn is more skilled than I think sometimes we'll want to give him credit for, particularly in politics. Let's remember, he has survived and thrived over the last 3 decades in Chicago Democrat politics, Rasputin-like he survived, just like Madigan and Cullerton. So that takes some skill, that takes some understanding of the landscape and picking your opportunities. And he's done that. He may be the accidental governor, but it took him 30 years to position himself to do that. So I think we should give him more credit for being skilled in this arena, because nothing is going to come easy in this state, and that's why it's going to take the same kind of commitment that the other side has, because of course government is their lifeblood. And secondly, it turns out he's not this kind-hearted, well-intended, generally amiable guy. Turns out that he's much more cold and calculating, much more cynical, willing to use other people as the means to his political ends, as the means to his political power. He's just as cavalier with the lives of others as are Madigan and Cullerton and the rest of the ruling class. And let me give you an example of this. This is now going back 5 years when the accidental governor first became the accidental governor. And that is one of the first things that Pat Quinn did was he issued an executive order, signed an executive order, that would allow SEIU to intervene between parents and their children, parents who have a child who has a developmental disability, so that SEIU could literally try and organize parents against their children. This was taking a home health care worker program that the state administers that provides a little stipend for the home health care worker for a person with a developmental disability. And as it turns out, most often that person providing the primary care is, of course, the parent, because they have the greatest interest and the greatest love for that individual with a disability. So it makes perfect sense. It was the rare instance where state government was actually aligned with the interests of the family. And so, of course, that couldn't stand. And Pat Quinn intervened, signed that order, and unleashed the purple people beaters on families who have children with developmental disabilities. This has actually gone all the way up to the Supreme Court thanks to the courage of some of these families that were targeted. It's the case of Pam Harris versus Quinn, and it's going to be rendered. There's going to be a holding issued by the Supreme Court this term, so let's cross our fingers on that. But this is somebody who put the interests of his public sector union financiers against and above the interests of families and our most vulnerable. Then in 2011, when Chicago Democrats rammed through the largest tax increase in Illinois history, the increase in the personal and corporate income taxes, that temporary increase that you heard about, Pat Quinn held a gun to social service providers at that time and said, you know, that's $7 billion worth of unpaid bills at the time that you want paid for services rendered, for goods provided. Well, if you're not on board for that temporary structural increase in personal and corporate income taxes, then we're just going to put your bills in the pay no mind file in the governor's office. And so social service providers lined up because they wanted to keep their doors open. Now fast forward 3 years later, a couple weeks ago with his budget address, where Pat Quinn wants to make that temporary tax increase permanent. Borrowing from Milton Friedman, there's nothing so permanent as a temporary Illinois tax increase. And what did Pat Quinn do after he announced that we need to make that tax increase permanent? Well, I know what he did because I talked specifically to some of the individuals that were targeted. He went to hospice providers, people who provide end-of-life care when families are at their most vulnerable, again. And he said to hospice providers, either you are on board with making this tax increase permanent, or I'm going to remove the tax credit that is provided in the state's Medicaid program so that families, when their family member is about to pass, can remove the individual from hospice for qualified hospices under the Medicare program, can remove their family member, take their family member home so they're out of an institutional setting for their last days, their last hours on this mortal coil. I'm going to threaten you to remove the ability to provide families with this option unless you're on board for my permanent income tax increase. So this is an individual who's generally nice and honest and caring and well-intended. He isn't. He's a person who does what political leaders in this state have done for far too long. He bullies people. He targets people that are vulnerable when they're at their most vulnerable. He pushes people around to sustain his political power at any cost. And people need to know this about Pat Quinn in advance of November so they know exactly what they're voting for and exactly what they should be voting against. And let me tell you something else that this does. These conversations about the human impact of public policy, the terrible impact of terrible public policy on our fellow residents and citizens, and the potential positive impact of proper public policy where the government is aligned with the interests of its constituents. It conveys that we are on the side of the skirmish line with people who have been fleeced by a state government they finance, fighting out against the ruling class. And if we convey believably that we are on that side of the skirmish line, then we are going to win all kinds of races that people don't think we can win. We are going to swing the pendulum back a lot faster than a lot of people think it can be swung, because that is really, I think, the appetite that needs to be served in this state. That's what people are looking for. And they say it in no uncertain terms. And if you don't think it can be swung back more quickly than anticipated, all you have to do is pick your head up and look around at what is going on in our neighboring states. There was a piece in the Wall Street Journal today, what's the matter with Illinois, comparing Illinois to the 4 neighboring states with Republican governors. But those things didn't happen overnight. You know, the miracle of Indiana, where 12 years ago, before Mitch Daniels was elected governor, Indiana was a punchline to Illinois. Now we see billboards all over the expressways here. Illinois, if you had enough, come to a state that works. Indiana, we're the punchline. Boy, they flipped the script on us pretty quickly. But prior to Mitch Daniels getting elected in 2002, Democrats held the governor's mansion in Indiana for 16 years and destroyed that state. It took Mitch Daniels and Republicans a decade to turn that state around. So the overnight success, that was 25 years in the making and 10 years in the doing, right? Scott Walker in Wisconsin, nobody before 2010 was predicting Scott Walker was going to be governor. Republicans were going to control the state legislature in Wisconsin. Ron Johnson would be the senator. And look at what's happened to Wisconsin in 3 years and 3 elections. Scott Walker has proven the free enterprise model works. He has solved the riddle that no other state has solved. You can fully fund your public sector pensions. Wisconsin is the only state with fully funded public sector pensions. And you can also have $1 billion budget deficit, and budget surplus, excuse me. And you can also cut taxes. And you can expand school choice. And you can move your state 25 places in terms of hospitable business climate, where businesses want to locate, where capital wants to reside. Scott Walker's, and importantly, stout of heart Republicans in that state legislature have done that in 3 years. Who would have thought? Who would have thought that Michigan would pass right-to-work laws anytime this millennia? And Rick Snyder, who's probably the best proxy for the matchup we have here, a successful venture capitalist, first run for office was governor, and with a Republican-controlled state legislature is turning Michigan around. Who would have thought that could happen? And it's happened, again, in 3 short years. People always underestimate how bad things can get, but they underestimate how good things can get, too. And we have to have the courage of our convictions to speak with moral clarity about the principles that we hold, and with specificity about the policies that flow from those principles, about the positive human impact of these ideas that we have, about who we are intending to serve and how, and who we are intending to fight and for how long. And I think if we do that, you'd be surprised at how quickly we could change the conversation. As I said, I get around the state quite a bit, and I'll tell you, you talk to anybody with the means of mobility, and I'm not talking about people with 7-figure net worths, I'm talking about people who could afford to rent a U-Haul. And the conversation is about their exit strategy from Illinois, right? And every time I say that, everybody in the audience says, yeah, right, exactly, because I'm thinking the same thing. 2 years, I retire and we're out of here. 2 years, the kids are out of school and we're out of here. Well, it doesn't have to be that way. Why should we leave? The ones in charge are the people who suck. They should leave. They should be forced to abdicate. And I think if we pursue kind of the market positioning I'm describing, they will be forced to advocate. And maybe in the not too distant future, a couple, 3 years down the road, you'll have people at Lincoln Day dinners in Lansing and Indianapolis and Ames talking about what's going on in Illinois with Bruce Rauner and this plucky band of Republicans that have taken control of the state legislature there. These things can't happen. They can't happen. The pendulum is swinging, and we need to continue to build the momentum behind that swing. And as I said, if we're on the side of the skirmish line of people who play by the rules in this state and who have been violated and bullied by a state government that they finance, then it won't be too long between now and majority, and it won't be too long before we have we have the opportunity to implement our ideas and start to improve conditions in this state. Thanks very much.